A 63-year-old man was lashed to the rigging of a warship, sailed straight into a field of live mines, and watched the ship in front of him vanish beneath the waves in under 30 seconds. He didn't turn back. He gave an order that's been quoted in the U.S. Navy for 160 years. This is the story of Admiral David Farragut and the Battle of Mobile Bay. By the summer of 1864, the Civil War had ground into its fourth brutal year, 4 years of marching, siege, and staggering loss that had worn down both sides but had not broken either one. And by this point in the war, the Union was tightening a stranglehold on the Confederacy called the Anaconda Plan. The idea was simple, even if the execution took years. Squeeze every southern port shut, one by one, cutting off the flow of goods in and out, until the Confederacy couldn't bring in supplies or send out cotton to sell to the rest of the world. Port by port, the noose had been tightening, and by August 1864, Mobile, Alabama, was one of the last major Confederate ports still open, and the last major one on the Gulf Coast east of the Mississippi River. Everywhere else along that stretch of coastline had already fallen to Union forces or been sealed off by the blockade. Mobile was the exception, a real gap in the wall, and everyone on both sides knew it. If Mobile Bay closed, a vital Confederate Gulf lifeline closed with it, and one more artery feeding the Southern war effort would be cut for good. The man tasked with closing it was David Glasgow Farragut, a career naval officer who'd been at sea, quite literally, since he was 9 years old. Born in Tennessee in 1801, he was taken into a Navy family as a boy and grew up around ships, rigging, and saltwater instead of a classroom. He'd served on ships since the War of 1812, which means that by the time he stood on the deck of a warship in Mobile Bay, he had already spent half a century of his life at sea, through wars, through peacetime postings, through the slow climb up the ranks. By 1864, he was 63 years old, an age when most men of his era, especially men who had spent decades in uniform, were long retired, settled ashore, done with the dangers of combat. Farragut was not done. He was about to lead one of the most daring naval assaults in American history, and he was going to do it in person, in the thick of the fighting, rather than direct it from somewhere safe. Here's what stood between Farragut and Mobile Bay, and it was not a small obstacle. Guarding the entrance was Fort Morgan, a massive brick fortress bristling with cannons, its walls built thick enough to withstand naval bombardment, its guns positioned to rake any ship that dared come within range. Backing it up was the smaller Fort Gaines, sitting across the channel on the opposite shore, so that any vessel entering the bay would have to run a gauntlet of fire. Inside the bay itself waited a Confederate flotilla commanded by Admiral Franklin Buchanan, and that flotilla was built around one truly terrifying weapon, the CSS Tennessee, an ironclad ram plated in thick iron armor, one of the most powerful warships the Confederacy ever built. She wasn't fast, and she wasn't nimble, but she didn't need to be. Her armor alone made her a floating fortress capable of shrugging off the kind of cannon fire that would tear a wooden ship apart. And as if a fortified harbor entrance and an ironclad monster weren't enough, scattered across the mouth of the bay, hidden just beneath the surface of the water where no lookout could spot them, sat rows of tethered naval mines, which in that era everyone simply called torpedoes. These weren't the self-propelled torpedoes we picture today, the kind that streak through the water toward a target. They were something cruder and in some ways more sinister. Floating bombs, anchored to the bay floor by chains or cables, packed with black powder, sitting silently underwater and waiting for a hull to bump into them. No warning, no wake, no way to see them coming until it was too late. The Confederates had left one narrow channel near Fort Morgan clear of mines, deliberately, so their own ships and blockade runners could slip in and out without blowing themselves up. It was a practical necessity for them, but it also forced any Union fleet using it to pass close under Fort Morgan's guns. Farragut knew that channel existed. He knew where the intended path lay. And on the morning of August 5, 1864, he aimed his fleet toward it. At dawn, Farragut's fleet formed up for the assault. 14 wooden warships lashed together in pairs for mutual support, so that if one vessel took a crippling hit, its partner could keep it moving and keep it in the fight. Leading alongside them were 4 ironclad monitors, low, heavily armored vessels positioned between the fort and the wooden ships to absorb the fort's cannon fire as the fleet advanced. Farragut's flagship was the USS Hartford, a screw sloop that had carried him through battle after battle down the Mississippi River in earlier campaigns, a ship he trusted, and one that trusted him back, in the way that a crew comes to trust a commander who has already led them through fire. And this is where the legend really begins. Farragut knew that once the guns opened up, the deck would be choked with gun smoke, thick enough to blind him to his own fleet at the exact moment he needed to see it most clearly. So he climbed into the rigging of the Hartford near the main shrouds, high enough above the deck to see over the rising smoke, and a sailor secured him there with a length of rope so that he wouldn't fall. Picture it, a 63-year-old admiral, high above his own deck, bound to the ship by rope, determined to keep sight of the fight no matter what happened below. At 6:47 in the morning, the lead monitor USS Tecumseh opened fire on Fort Morgan, and the battle began in earnest. The Tecumseh, commanded by Commander Tunis Craven, pushed ahead toward the CSS Tennessee and crossed the line marking the edge of the minefield as she maneuvered to engage the Confederate ironclad. It was a small deviation, made in the heat of maneuvering for position, and that's when the bay floor answered back. The Tecumseh struck a mine. The explosion tore into her hull, and the ship rolled over and sank in less than a minute. Some accounts say as little as 25 seconds, barely enough time to process what was happening before she was gone. Of the 114 men aboard, 93 went down with her, including Commander Craven himself, who, as the story goes, stepped back from the ladder at the last second to let his pilot climb out first. There simply wasn't time for both of them, and Craven made his choice in an instant. You can imagine what that did to the rest of the fleet, watching from just behind. Ships behind the Tecumseh saw an ironclad monitor, supposedly one of the toughest, most heavily armored vessels in the entire Union Navy, disappear beneath the water in under a minute. Right beside the channel they were all about to sail through themselves. The fleet began to stall and bunch up, ships losing formation under heavy fire from Fort Morgan's guns, panic setting in as captains hesitated, unsure whether to push forward with a minefield just beside them that had swallowed a warship whole in front of their eyes. Smoke rolled across the water. Cannon fire kept coming from the fort, and the entire assault teetered on the edge of collapse, bottled up in the worst possible place to stop moving. And it's in that moment, smoke everywhere, cannon fire raining down, his lead ship gone, his fleet grinding to a halt in exactly the spot where hesitation was most dangerous, that Farragut, lashed up in the rigging of the Hartford, made the call that would define the entire battle. He shouted down through the chaos, ordering the Hartford forward, past the stalled ships, to take the lead herself and drive through the minefield that had just claimed the Tecumseh. The exact wording has been debated by historians for generations, because nobody was taking dictation in the middle of a naval battle with shells falling and smoke choking the air. But it's been passed down through Navy tradition as, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." Whatever the precise phrase, the message was unmistakable. The fleet was not stopping, not today, not with Mobile Bay this close after months of planning and buildup. And remarkably, as the Hartford and the ships following her pushed through the very minefield that had just claimed the Tecumseh, no other Union vessel was sunk by a mine. Some of the mines had gone inert after sitting in salt water, their powder degraded or their firing mechanisms fouled. Others simply failed to detonate. It was a gamble that could have ended in catastrophe, ship after ship going down the way the Tecumseh had, and instead, against the odds, it worked. With the fleet through the minefield and past the forts, the fight shifted to open water inside the bay, and that's where the CSS Tennessee made her stand. Admiral Buchanan sailed his ironclad ram directly at the Union fleet, trying to take on more than a dozen ships virtually by herself, trusting in her thick iron armor to see her through. For more than an hour, Union vessels rammed her, circled her, and pounded her with point-blank cannon fire from every angle they could manage. The Tennessee's armor held for a remarkably long time, absorbing blow after blow that would have sunk an ordinary ship outright. But eventually her steering chains were shot away, leaving her unable to turn. Her smokestack was badly damaged, and Buchanan himself was wounded in the leg. With the ship crippled and unable to maneuver, the Tennessee finally struck her colors and surrendered. With the Confederate ironclad out of the fight and the Union fleet safely through the gauntlet of forts and mines, the battle for Mobile Bay was effectively won. Fort Gaines surrendered just a few days later, on August 8th. Fort Powell was abandoned and partially blown up by its own garrison rather than be captured, its defenders choosing to deny it to the enemy rather than hand it over intact. And after weeks of sustained Union bombardment, Fort Morgan itself surrendered on August 23, 1864, finally sealing the bay under Union control. It's worth noting that the city of Mobile itself didn't fall until the following spring, but its port, its usefulness to the Confederacy as a lifeline for supplies and blockade runners, was finished that August, and everyone on both sides understood it. The victory at Mobile Bay landed at exactly the right moment for the Union war effort. It came just weeks before Union forces captured Atlanta, and together those two victories gave Northern morale and President Lincoln's re-election campaign a tremendous boost heading into the fall of 1864, at a time when war weariness back home had been running dangerously high. Farragut himself would go on to make history again in the years that followed. In December of 1864, he was made the Navy's first vice admiral, and in 1866, the first ever full admiral in the history of the United States Navy, ranks created by Congress in recognition of what he'd accomplished at Mobile Bay and throughout his long career. But it's that one moment that's endured the longest, an admiral in his 60s, tied to the rigging of his flagship, refusing to let smoke or fear or a sunken ironclad stop him from driving his fleet through a minefield. "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead," has been etched onto Navy memorials, quoted by naval officers for a century and a half, and it remains one of the most famous lines in all of American military history, born from a real morning, on a real ship, in a real bay in Alabama on August 5, 1864. If you enjoyed this dive into one of the Navy's most legendary moments, stick around. There are a lot more incredible true stories from American history waiting for you. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.